on the banks of the Mississippi, across the West in a covered wagon. A while back I came across this book. This is a journal of Henrietta Catherine Ellis that came across the U.S. in a covered wagon. She started in Canton, Mississippi. Now the characters in this journal are a brother and sister. The brother's name is James Ellis, Henrietta's husband. He was known as Bud. And his sister, Lizzie, her husband, Chris. And they brought their children. They had young children. So Lizzie and Chris had their two young kids. Bud and Henrietta, also known as Rhett, had a 9-month-old baby that they took with them on a covered wagon. So 1865. What was happening then? It was just the end of the Civil War. They left in the end of April. Abraham Lincoln had just been assassinated. What pushed them to get into this godforsaken vehicle? I'm going to go ahead and pass this around. This is a picture of the covered wagon from that time. Why did they get into this? Well, at that time, the frontier was wide open and ready to be settled. They were giving land grants of 160 acres to anybody who would make the trek. But boy, you had to be strong. These were some really strong people and a strong family. And you either built or bought a wagon and got a team of horses or oxen, hooked it up, put whatever you could get them to carry in there, and you headed off. And they headed off as a family group, but often would travel with other groups. They'd get together with larger teams of wagons. So what did they face along this journey? They faced a lot of grief and fear and adventure. So at one point they were pulling in, they'd gotten all the way as far as Omaha, and as they often did, they made camp that night, and the boys, Bud and Chris, went into town to get all the news and to see if there was any mail. The gals waited at the camp, made their dinner, and waited. They were just listening for the sound of horses' hooves to wait for that anticipation of a letter. And then they listened for that. The horses came back. The boys came back. They're waiting. No letters. That night was a very, very lonely night. They had hoped for letters. I am so sad today. I'm so homesick. No letters for anybody. It seems to me if I were back home, I would never leave. They also experienced, well, that next morning, they all went in. They packed up their wagon and they all went into town and they bought what they could or bartered and got the materials they needed for the next leg of their trip. And there was a commotion at the post office. The mail had come. So they all ran over there, got their letters, and there were letters from home, and they could hear how everybody was doing and how the family was and the child that was born and the only connection that they had, this Pony Express that could travel much faster than they were traveling, 2 miles an hour, walking across the country. Because the wagons were these wagons with no springs or anything, just the wheels, very, very uncomfortable to ride in. You're bouncing along and you feel every little tiny stone. And so most of the time they walked. And they were, and the grief that they felt too for losing things along the way. 1 in 10 people died on this trek across the country. And oftentimes they just had to be left right there. That they would dig the graves and have a ceremony and be left. And it was so heartbreaking to pass these graves on the road and know that these families, that there were people that had to leave their loved ones there. And the terrifying thing was that there were big holes dug at the end of these graves for the animals to get in. It's very, very terrifying, such a different sense of reality from what we have today. And there was a lot of fear. One of the things they were afraid of was losing their cattle. The cattle were not carcerelled. And so they were really just going with them. They would move them along, and they'd go to bed at night, and they'd tie a horse up, but if you tie a horse to the wagon, the horse is going to keep you up all night, bumping against the wagon. So they just would camp, and the animals would be there. And one morning, they woke up, and Carrie looks out of the wagon, dead quiet. Nothing's there. There's no cattle. They're all gone. Well, Carrie and Lizzie were absolutely terrified. They were convinced the Indians had come and taken them all. And so they went down to the creek and they looked for footprints. Well, Bud and Chris were a little bit more confident about this, so they went out actually to go find the cattle. And they went 5 miles and they found them. And they corralled them back up, brought them home, packed up the wagon, and moved on. And they were always in fear. They were always in fear of the Indians. It was the greatest fear they experienced. There were times when they would, especially when they were heading out across the plains, that there was some alarm, there was some sign of an Indians around them. They would see the smoke, they would see a band come up to the top of the hill and look, and then there would be this fierce cry throughout the whole wagon train, "Circle the wagons, circle the wagons!" And they would circle them out, and one time, of course, they were too late, and the guy in the back got scalped. But interestingly enough, while it was the greatest fear, it really was the least likely way that you would lose your life on the train. It was mostly sanitation and poor lack of food or something like that. The Indians were really not a big threat, they were just a great fear. But then imagine this sense of adventure. I'm going to send this around. This is a picture of Henrietta. Here, Carl, if you can pass that one around. And here is also another picture of the wagon and the wagon trains as they're going through the pass. Imagine with your family, we go on these family trips, but they've gone on this whole new life adventure. A brand new life. All the things they saw. Just the amazing landscape and animals and what was lying ahead of them. Henrietta wrote one day, "I have wished for the eye of an artist, that I might fix indelibly upon canvas the beautiful scenery by which we are surrounded, or even for the pen of an author, that I might portray in graceful and eloquent language the beauties of nature and nature's God." I think she did a pretty good job. Across the West in a covered wagon. This is an amazing story. So what is it about this that's so compelling, other than it's of a woman, strong, pioneering, incredible? Well, many of you know, not the guests, but many of you know who've heard my speeches before know that from my mother, I'm a first-generation American. But from my father's side, I'm a fifth-generation Californian. And this journal is the journal of my great-great-grandmother, who came across in a covered wagon and settled in Dixon, California, just south of Sacramento. That's where I'm from. So thank you very much, Mr.
Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, and wonderful, awesome guests. I don't think I've ever been to a meeting where I've seen so many guests. That's just fantastic. We love that. Monique gave a wonderful, wonderful speech, bringing history to life. She was talking from Project 5 of the Storytelling Manual. And to understand the main objectives was to understand the purpose of stories about historical events or people. And also to use those storytelling skills developed in preceding projects to tell a story about a historical event or person. And I think she did that very, very well. Made me think about a covered wagon, a very carceral experience, something I would not want to do. The plot was very clear from the start. She had a great opening line, how it all started on the banks of the Mississippi, and asking that question about why would anybody want to make this kind of adventure, especially when you have small children. I thought she did a great job of explaining that those land grants were very compelling and they would take that risk to get there. She did a lot to help build to the climax of the story, because weren't we all surprised to hear that the journal was really from 5th generation of her family? That's extraordinary. Then to pass around the photos, I was even thinking, how does she have all these kind of pictures? That's so amazing. And for people to hang on to history like that, it means so much. I'm sure it does to you with your family. You did a very good job of developing the characters. You wore the hat. That was extremely helpful for us. I would suggest perhaps maybe even demonstrate a little bit what it might be like to be bumping up and down in a covered wagon, especially with the little one right there pulling on the skirts. It's just any way that you can kind of immerse us more into the tale. But you did immerse us anyway, but that would just be one way to add. Great job on emphasizing that strong pioneering effort where they had to face things like fear, grief, adventure. And you interjected a lot of nice stories with that. So especially when they were going to town and they were anticipating getting a letter and how much that would mean. It makes me think of a lot of veterans during wartime, how important it was for them. When there's no mail, it's absolutely devastating disappointment. I think you illustrated that really, really well. And to quote from the journal, if I was back home, I would never leave. I think everyone in the room could feel that, what that would feel like. Making comparisons too with the Pony Express and going 2 miles an hour on a covered wagon. That was absolutely depressing. Loved it. The only other suggestion I would make, maybe, is maybe more information on your relatives. I know you wanted to keep that as a surprise, but a little bit more revealing about their personalities. And then interjecting with that, what are you like with some of those relatives? When family members say, oh, you're just like your great-grandmother, your great-grandmother. How did you know? Excellent job.